Let's talk now about kinship terminologies, which is honestly probably the most complicated thing in anthropology. We are not going to try and spell it all out. You couldn't do that in this amount of time. But I do want to give you a sense of why it's complicated and the kinds of variation that exist. Let's start out with words for kinship. We're used to the idea that languages have different words for their kin. Brother in English, or frère in French, or bror in Danish, or frater in Latin, or whatever. There are lots of different words for brother. What most of us don't realize is that it's not just the names that are different, but the concepts behind them as well. For example, kinds of cousins. In our system, a cousin is a term for almost any collateral relative. That is, someone in your lineage who isn't one of your ancestors or your aunts or your uncles, right? So your mother's brother's son is a cousin. Your father's sister's daughter is a cousin. Your father's father's sister's daughter's son is a cousin, and so on and so on and so on. The gender doesn't matter. We call them all cousins. Now, as you probably know, French uses different words for the two genders, cousin for male and cousine for female. There's a famous French movie called Cousin, Cousine. Again, that's a pretty simple distinction that we don't use, but it's one that we probably recognize. But you can also distinguish between cross and parallel cousins. What are those? Well, most Americans don't use that distinction, but it's a very important one in a lot of cultures. The way to understand it is to start off by thinking about your aunts and uncles. Here's a diagram of the family of a male person who's indicated in blue. You can see that he has a father and a mother, and that each of them have a brother and a sister. Now, we would usually call the brothers uncles and the sisters aunts. We wouldn't make any kind of distinction between them. We could, of course, do that if we wanted to. In Danish, for example, you would call the mother's sister moster and the father's sister faster. And you would think of them slightly differently. You'd expect to be closer to your moster than to your faster, because usually there's an expectation that sisters are closer to one another than brothers. Another distinction you could make, though, involves the match between your parents' gender and the aunt and uncle's gender. If they're the same, you could call them parallel. As you can see in this diagram, your father's brother and your mother's sister could be described as your parallel uncle and your parallel aunt. Their children would be your parallel first cousins, your father's brother's children and your mother's sister's children. Now, these would be your cross aunt and uncle, your father's sister and your mother's brother. Their children would be your cross first cousins. So you have cross cousins and you have parallel cousins. Now, why does this matter? Well, look carefully at this diagram of cross cousins. Suppose you're in a patrilineal society. Your lineage group is going to be the same as your father's group, the same as your father's brother's group, and the same as your father's brother's children's group. In other words, your parallel cousins on your father's side are going to be in your lineage. Your cross cousins, on the other hand, your father's sister's children, are going to be in a different lineage, their father's lineage. Now, in a matrilineal society, it would work on the other side. Your parallel cousins on your mother's side would be in your lineage, but the cross cousins would not. Now, in a lot of societies, that would affect rules of incest. It would be fine to marry your cross cousins because, after all, they're not in your family, but it would be taboo to marry your parallel cousins. The point of all this is that it's not just a matter of having different words for your relatives in different cultures, but that there are real differences in the idea of the kinds of relatives that exist, and those have implications for your relationships to them. Now, sometimes differences in kinship terminology can get a lot more complicated than that. One of the places you see it most strongly is in what we refer to as classificatory kinship systems. Classificatory kinship systems are ones in which certain types of people are grouped together, so that some non-lineal relatives are treated as lineal relatives. There's another term, sorry about this, there are a lot of them. A lineal relative is a relative who's in your direct line. In a patrilineal society, that would be your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and so on. And you might include their brothers as well. That would also include your son, his son, and so on. Again, all in a patrilineal society. Non-lineal relatives are basically everyone else, the people we would refer to as cousins. Your father's brother's children, your father's father's brother's children's children, and so on. They are related to you, but they are not lineal relatives. In a matrilineal system, it would be the same on the other side. Your mother, your grandmother, her mother, and so on would all be your lineal relatives. Now, sometimes cultures will group some of those together, and we call that classificatory kinship. You classify some non-lineal relatives as lineal relatives. This can get ridiculously complicated. Now, the simplest kind of classificatory kinship is called Hawaiian kinship because it was first described among the indigenous populations of Hawaii. This system is strictly based on gender and generation. It groups people together that way, and it makes no other distinctions among them. So in this diagram, we have our hero, Fred, and he lives in Hawaii. These two people he calls brother and sister, just as we would call them brother and sister in mainstream American culture. He also calls these people brother and sister, people whom we would call his first cousins. Now, that doesn't extend to in-laws, it doesn't extend to their spouses, but any consanguinal relative in his own generation is going to be called brother and sister. Not just first cousins, but second cousins and third cousins as well. If they're related to him by blood and they're in his generation, he's going to call them brother or sister. And I want to stress that he's not just going to call them brother and sister, he's going to think of them as brother and sister. He will probably be aware of who his biological brother and sister are, but he's not going to talk to them any differently, and he's not going to treat them very differently than any of the other people he calls brother and sister. Now, on the next generation, he has what we would call the father and the mother. But he will also call these people father and mother, people we would call aunt and uncle. In the generation down, he'll have the people we would call son and daughter, but he would also call the people son and daughter whom we would describe as nieces and nephews. That's also the case for the grandparents' generation, where everyone's called grandmother or grandfather, and for the grandchildren's generation, where everyone is a grandson or granddaughter. The distinctions that we make in mainstream American society between brothers, sisters, and cousins would be irrelevant to them. Their kinship just tells you the generation and the gender of the people involved, and that's all you need to know in order to figure out how to treat people. Now, a somewhat more complex version of this is what we call Iroquois Dravidian kinship. Love these names. Named after the two societies in which they were first described, the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy in northeastern United States and the Dravidian cultures of the Indian subcontinent. It's the same basic system, but the Iroquois system is matrilineal and the Dravidian one is patrilineal. We don't need to worry about that too much for right now. Now, in this one, we can start off again with Fred, who is now in a society using Iroquoian kinship. Like us, he will have a word for brother and sister, and he will call these people brother and sister. Do you notice anything about them? These are his parallel cousins, his father's brother's children and his mother's sister's children. They will be referred to as brother and sister, and he will treat them very much like the people we would call brother and sister. The people in green here would have a different term, one that translates to male cross-cousin and female cross-cousin. Now, in the next generation up, parallel aunts and uncles are called mother and father, while there is a separate term for cross aunts and uncles. The same thing is true one generation down, with parallel nieces and nephews referred to as son and daughter, and cross ones referred to as cross niece and nephew. Now, if you think about this, you can see that this is a very good way to think about family in societies with very strong lineages. The people who are in your lineage, your parallel relatives, are made very close to you. They're not just your relatives, they're your brothers and sisters, your father and mother, your son and daughter. They are as critical to you and as closely related to you as the people in your direct line. Now, the people who aren't in your lineage, your cross relatives, are very different. You don't belong with them in the same way. You don't owe them the same kind of things. And that's underlined in the terms that you use to talk about them. Now, if Dravidian Iroquois terminology isn't complicated enough for you, you could use Crow-Omaha kinship terminology, which is famously impenetrable. Again, it was first described among the indigenous Crow and Omaha peoples in North America, one of them patrilineal and the other matrilineal. But you find it all over the world, including a number of places in New Guinea that, interestingly, have had historically no connection with North America at all. These kinship systems seem to develop independently in a lot of different places. Now, I sometimes teach an upper division course on social organization, and in that one we spend about 3 hours going through this, and I'm not going to subject you to that. But here is a diagram of what it looks like. It involves a lot of distinctions between cross-cousins and parallel family members, but also some reversals of generation, so that you would use the term sister to refer not only to your biological sister and to your parallel female cousins on your mother's side, but also to certain cross-cousins on your father's side, including people who may be 2 generations younger than you are. You would refer to your father's, sister's, daughter's son as father, right from the time you meet him when he's a baby. It sounds a little confusing, and trust me, it is. A lot of anthropology graduate students have a lot of trouble with this. The interesting thing is, like most things, if you grow up in a society like that, it's not complicated at all. It's as simple as traffic regulations are to us. And it's very important if you want to understand other societies. Remember, family is one of the most basic things in your existence. Before you knew anything else, before you knew what culture was, before you knew what cars were, before you knew what houses and dogs and so on were, you knew your mother. You knew your father, you knew your brothers, your sisters. Even in our modern, impersonal, computer-driven world, it's our families who mean the most to us and who shape our world the most completely. To understand how any of the societies anthropologists look at work, we have to understand how family works for them, which means that figuring out all this bizarre kinship stuff is the first and most essential step to entering their world. And indeed, when you do field work, in a different culture, figuring out their kinship system and learning how people are related to each other is in many ways the key that's going to open up the whole cultural system to you.